back in April, we interviewed a lot of students.
Yay.
We asked them a series of questions that we thought would be really good for the series. And one of them was, what is the role of government? And so before we actually get started on what is the biblical role of government, I thought it'd be really cool to see some other people's opinions on the matter. I don't know how good the sound's going to be, so hopefully we can hear this. If not, I'll stop it.
The role of government should be to serve in the people's best interest.
The role of government is to actually provide us with a stable environment and everyone we are able to inhabit in, and basically so that everything governs accordingly, give us a set boundary for what we can and are not able to do in society.
Government is obviously necessary. It's needed to provide a strong central source of leadership to keep people moving in a general direction, hopefully a good one.
The role of government is to be the voice of the people. If the people would like something changed, government should do all in its power to change it, and if it can, it should definitely improve upon the thing, whatever it may be that is not doing as well as it should be for our country.
Protect and serve its people.
I think that it's just there really for the people to hear their voices and to represent the people and to do what the people would like. And sometimes that's not always the case, but I think that that was the sole purpose in the beginning.
The role of government is to maintain order.
Someone who sets the laws and standards of the United States and helps run the country.
To keep order, pretty much.
Government, I think, is to keep chaos from happening, which I know in some cases government causes chaos, but I mean, if you don't have laws that are deemed moral and deemed necessary, then everything's just going to go crazy.
The role of government currently is to control the anomalies in society and to provide service for people.
To do right by the people, to actually take in what the people want, not just be a bureaucracy. To protect citizens' private interests and to protect the minorities.
The role of government is to provide its people a good enough living standard to sustain life and have a good life, for people who are... Dang. That's a hard question. What's the role of the government? I guess it is to keep people safe. That's probably the main thing, to keep people safe.
Okay, so we had some interesting answers there. I think some we would agree with more than others. So, welcome to Ratio Christi. I am Patrick Collins, and tonight we'll be talking about the biblical role of civil government. Just as a quick clarification, last week I tried to point out that we're not a political club, and I realized later that that's not entirely true. As we try to apply the Bible to all areas of life, and since that's one of our goals as a club, really we are a political club. We're also a sociology club, an anthropology club, a biology club. We're an everything club because the Bible applies to all areas of life. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that our main thrust is not politics, but we're not afraid to go there. Now, last week we talked about where the need for the law. You know, if everyone was nice to each other, we probably wouldn't need it, but because people do harm one another, the institute of law and government is necessary. And so, biblically speaking, there are three institutes of government: the family, the church, and civil government. And our focus tonight will be the civil government. Either way, I'll try to make this as brief as possible. The concept of the biblical role of government is very, very large, for lack of better words, and complex. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible for my sake, if not yours. All right, so the three institutes of government. It should be clear that the creature has no authority or power to dictate or to establish the requirements of civil government. This responsibility belongs to the one who established the realm of civil government. Therefore, its authority should not extend beyond the requirements set by God. This means that the state is not to operate in the areas of the family, school, or church if the Bible makes no provision for the civil government's power and authority in these areas. Gary Udemar, God and Government. Before we get any further, according to our outline, we're going to apply the Old Testament and the New Testament to what we are discussing tonight. So to help us better understand how the Old Testament applies, we need to understand that much of the scripture that we have pertaining to government falls under two main realms for the Old Testament. The first is from Moses to Samuel. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. He was their leader until his death, and then Joshua took over. And then we had the period of Judges, and then Samuel, a prophet, took the lead. Under them, the main form of government from the Israelites was a theocracy. And so if you read the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, anything we could pull from there, we had to understand that it was under the guise that this was God's instituted government. Second, Saul, through the Babylonian captivity, it was a monarchy. So Saul was the one who was set as king by the prophet Samuel. After Saul, we have David, then Solomon, and so forth. Later on, because of Israel's disobedience, they were led into captivity after being conquered by the Babylonians. Up till that point, they were in a monarchy, but the king represented God. Israel had specific laws given to them, and there are 3 types of laws. You had the civil laws, which we can still pull principles about, because God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Therefore, even though the laws that we're going to read about from the Old Testament do not directly apply to us, we can get a glimpse into God's character and nature on why He instituted those laws for them. Second, the sacrificial laws, or some call them the ceremonial laws. Those laws are fulfilled in Christ. So sacrificing a dove or a goat or anything like that is Old Testament, Old Covenant, doesn't apply to us. So for our intents and purposes, we don't look at that. And finally, the moral law expresses the character and nature of God, primarily through the 10 Commandments, but also through other commandments. So one of our main bases for government, our key passage, is from 1 Peter chapter 2. And verses, really most of chapter 2 pertains to what we want to talk about, but these particular verses really sets the stage. All right, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the kings as supreme or to governors as those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. So 3 main keys here. First, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. So we're to obey the laws or the ordinances of men. We're doing it for the Lord's sake, to obey the Lord ultimately. Second, they are sent by God for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. We really don't see that second part very often in society. But occasionally we'll see that, especially like the Medal of Honor or something like that. But primarily what we see the government doing falls under the punishment of evildoers. And that is really the carrying out of the law. Another verse that also applies to this is Romans 13, 3 and 4. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister for you to do good. If you do evil, be very afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So Romans, Paul, who wrote Romans, views the government as God's minister. Now they may not seem like that, but Paul's really talking about the ideal, what God instituted the government for. A minister, the word simply means a servant, someone who serves. And so the government is supposed to be for our good, to protect us, to protect our rights, and it does not bear the sword in vain. And as we know, the sword is an instrument of violence and of judgment, in the sense of you can die by it, and therefore if a death penalty comes into you, there you go. All right, so God as the model government. I've been told that Isaiah 33:22 was used by the Founding Fathers as a justification for the tricameral system that we have. So the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king. So we have the three branches, the judicial branch, legislative, and the executive branch listed there by the interpretation of the Founding Fathers. I just thought it was just an interesting tidbit to throw out there. And God is also our model government through looking at the principles from the Old Testament, since he set up the theocracy. All right, so God is the supreme authority. This is where we were talking about last week, where either man is the ultimate authority or God is the ultimate authority. You know, we ultimately appeal to one or the other for the source of authority and source of rights. If God is the source of authority and he gives you unalienable rights, no one can take them away legitimately. If man is the ultimate source of rights, then man can take your rights away. Isaiah 9:6, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. All right, so the government is on his shoulders. That's showing that Jesus, who is the child that was born, as part of this prophecy and promise, the government is on his shoulders. He is given that authority over all nations. Matthew 28:18, and Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Second, all right, so Lord is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Revelation 17:14, these will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. 1 Timothy 6:15, which he will manifest in his own time, who is the blessed and only potentate, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Several other verses that refer to Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords are listed here. Psalm 22:28, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. Psalm 47:7-8, for God is the King of all the earth. Sing praises with understanding, for God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. So I think we get the point. He is where the buck stops there, ultimately. God delegates civil authority. This is really where we have our understanding of how God gives the government the power that it has. All right, so we have a little commentary from Charles Hodge on Romans 13:1. This is a very comprehensive proposition. All authority is of God. No man has any rightful power over other men, which is not derived from God. All human power is delegated and ministerial. This is true of parents, magistrates, and church officials. I really want you guys to really grasp this idea that no man has a power over any other man. You don't have any power over your neighbor, over your classmates, over anyone else, unless it's given to you by a higher authority. So we've read the commentary. Let's read the actual verse. Romans 13:1-2. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. I think in 1 Samuel around chapter 17, I didn't have time or opportunity to look at this particular verse, but it's talking about Israel about to have a king put in place. And the prophet is warning the people that the king is going to be reflective of the temperament of the society. If the society as a whole is good and is trying to serve God, you're going to have a good king. If the society as a whole, all right, God delegates civil authority. A few more. I'll let you read those for just a second. Just further making that point, and we'll move on. Now, the government's role to citizens. If God has delegated a role to the government, we need to know what that role is, at least in principle. This is Romans 13:3-4. Again, I read that a few minutes ago, but on the screen you can see that rulers or our leaders are not supposed to scare us or intimidate us if we're just doing good. If we haven't done anything wrong, we shouldn't worry about seeing the police or anyone come to our doorstep. We should, actually be glad because they're there to protect us. So if you want to be unafraid of authority, do it as good. For God's ministers to us, And I really want to hammer that in there because a lot of times we just, through society and other means, we have a negative feeling towards authority. And I really want us to see that God has established that for a good cause. And it is honoring to God to honor the authorities that He's put in place. He does not bear the sword in vain. He is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. All right, so leaders in office should reflect on God's law to define good. Because if we're going to have laws, and we talked about this last week, can we legislate morality? Can we, why do we set the laws that we have? Well, our leaders need to take heed to the warning of Scripture that we need to know what really is good and what really is evil. So when they make judgments, they are in line with the character and nature of God. Deuteronomy 17:18 says, "Also it shall be, when he sits in the throne of the kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in the book, from the one before the priests and Levites." Now the context of this is talking about the king. The king of Israel, when he's in place, is supposed to make a personal copy of the Scriptures. Now when you write something down, you remember it a lot better than if you just hear it or if you just read it typically. And I think beyond the fact that he's going to have his own personal copy is to make sure that he reads the whole thing. 1 Timothy 1:8, "But we know the law is good for the one that uses lawfully," talking about judges can use the law unlawfully. "The laws should not be subjective or based on any preferences." Isaiah 5:20, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, but put darkness for light and light for darkness, put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." Proverbs 17:15, "He who justifies the wicked, he who condemns the just, both alike are an abomination to the Lord." Strong words. Now the meat of what we're talking about tonight is going to be the judicial system. All right, Gary DeMar again, wise guy. A ministry of justice, and that's really what the government is supposed to be serving as. A ministry of justice requires the establishment of a judicial system to hear cases of those accused of crimes, Leviticus 19:15, Deuteronomy 16:19 and 20. Development of a restitution system for those convicted of crimes, Exodus 22:1 through 17, and a well-ordered militia to protect citizens from domestic and foreign enemies. A couple other verses there. Moreover, judges and courts must be maintained, as well as local police powers. Taxes are needed to make law enforcement a reality. So that's our thesis. Let's prove it. All right, Exodus 18 has a ton of laws in it. We're going to focus just on a couple of them. Actually, no, I'm wrong. It's Exodus 19 and 22, but Exodus 18 is important as well. This kind of sets up our tiered court system with qualified judges. This is where Moses is acting as judge for the entire nation of Israel, and it's taking forever because everyone's coming to him with problems. His father-in-law, Jethro, says, "Hey, I've got some wisdom for you." Starting in verse 19, you don't have that, but I'll read all the way through. "Listen now to my voice," that's Jethro speaking to Moses. "I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so that you may bring the difficulties to God. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws. Show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do." In other words, Moses, you train the judges. Make sure they know the law. "Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s, and let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, and for they will bear the burden with you." So the idea is you make various sized districts, and you have judges that roll over that district. Now, if a problem that's really huge comes up, and they roll, it's too hard, or I need backup, you send it up to the higher court. So really interesting that even back then they had a system like that in place. They're also guaranteed, through the judicial system, a quick and fair trial. Ecclesiastes 8:11. "If a law isn't enforced quickly, others are likely to violate it." My paraphrase for time. James 2:1 through 13. "Don't show partiality and don't be biased against the poor." And if you remember in James, it's talking about how a lot of people were coming into the church really haughty with gold and jewelry and expensive things, and they're getting better treatment. Well, that principle also applies to just don't discriminate against the poor or someone that may be thought of as a lower class than you. Everyone should be viewed equal, especially in the eyes of the judges and government. All right, so for whom are the laws meant? Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for the sinners, for the unholy and profane and murderers, and so on and so forth. The point is, if we're all doing fine and good, and we're being nice to each other, there's really not an inherent need in having a legal system of law. Its primary purpose is to protect and to give restitution. Now, Israel had many criminal and restitution laws. Now, crimes are committed against each other, and therefore punishment must be just. The restitution allows the victim to be compensated, as well as the criminal to pay his debts to society. Prison time may have originally only been a temporary punishment unto trial. So the idea, if you look at the Old Testament, especially all throughout Exodus, pretty much from the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, all the way through chapter 23, you see a pattern of restitution. If someone does something wrong to somebody else, they're not just thrown in jail, or they're not thrown in jail, they're brought before a judge, and they have to give restitution. They have to make up for what damage they caused. All right, so an example for assault. If men are content with each other, and if men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks outside with his staff, then he who struck him will be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time, and shall provide him to be thoroughly healed. For theft or killing in self-defense. If a man steals an ox or a sheep, and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore the 5 oxen, 4 an ox, and 4 sheep for sheep. Agricultural and farm-based society here. If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the theft is certainly found alive in his hand, whether it is an ox or donkey or sheep, he shall restore double. So I hope you're seeing that there's starting to be a pattern here of what restitution really means. That it's not just giving back what you took, but also, in this case, double. And if you self-defend yourself or your property, and someone dies as a direct result of that, you are not guilty of manslaughter. Other crimes and restitution laws, property damage, loss or damage of property, liability, and bodily injury. I won't read those passages for time's sake, but I want you guys to really think, this is a really comprehensive system of being able to have people that cause damage to someone else or worse to be able to have a system that they can pay their debt back to society and then move on with their life. One of the commentators I read on this said that the penitentiary system, where you're in jail for so many years, is really a recent development. Now let me preface this with most cases that this guy has researched, and he didn't really say how much he researched, but in pretty much every case that he read prior to the founding of America, and really the exploration of America, jail was only used as a temporary holding until someone could make it in front of a judge. It was this guy attributes it to the Quakers in the very beginning of, really before the founding of our country, where they believed that if someone was put in jail for long enough, they would really think about what they did, they would be sorry, and they would repent. Thus, penance, thus penitentiary. That was really the goal there. Yes?
How long was the Apostle Paul in prison? For a while?
If you read the passages, they usually had a qualifier for he was put in prison to be seen by a judge. The longest time he was in prison that we can tell is 2 or 3 years towards the end of his life. He was in Rome, and he had to travel to Rome with an escort, and he was in Rome for 2 years. Really interesting tidbit for first century Roman guards. They didn't feed people in jail. If you wanted to be fed, you hoped that one of your friends knew you were there and they'd bring you food every so often. And especially for Paul, once he was in Rome, he was actually under house arrest, which meant that he was pretty much stuck in the house, but he could have over any guest he wanted. So he can continue his ministry that way. And of course, there was always a guard over him. But I thought it was interesting that jail time really isn't an ancient concept. It's more of a recent concept. And he also listed like Joseph and Daniel being put in places. If you actually look at the description, it doesn't really say a holding cell, or it didn't indicate a long-term jail. It's just more of a temporary thing to hold people. And in Joseph's case, he was put into servitude. And in Daniel's case, he came out of lion's den, or he came out of whatever after a while. So he received his judgment and moved on. But with restitution laws, the idea was there's consequences for your actions. Think twice. Perjury, going back to the court system. Proverbs 19:9, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who speaks lies will not escape. You can also see there's other verses. Both of those other verses are really long passages, 5 and 8 verses, and it really talks about if it's found out that someone lied to the court, then typically whatever the case overall was that he was lying about, like, oh yeah, he didn't steal the sheep, all of a sudden he is having to pay restitution for that as well because he's an accomplice. All right, so here's the really fun one, public punishment as a form of deterrent. Our country's really moved away from this. Deuteronomy 17:13, and all the people shall hear and fear and no longer act presumptuously. Out of context, it's talking about people being punished and being punished in public. We used to have public hangings just so that people knew what they did to gunslingers or whatever it was, the crime that was due the death penalty. Deuteronomy 19:20, and those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. So another passage that talks about people see punishment done in public, and that's a sign that if you're going to do this, if you commit a crime, oftentimes the punishment would just have you punished in public so that people would be reminded, don't do this or else. This is what's going to happen to you. The very first verse in the Bible about the death penalty is Genesis 9:6, which says, whoever sheds a man's blood, by his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he was made. The justification is, man is made in the image of God, therefore he has worth and value. And because you killed a representation of the image of God, you shall be killed as well. More verses on death penalty, Deuteronomy 17:6 and Hebrews 10:28. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So they were very smart to make sure that people couldn't work the system. All right, limits to government. Really fun topic because we really don't see that in the media today or in our government. All right, the government should have limits. We kind of mentioned that at the very beginning, where there's the institution of the church, the family, and the state. Now, the affairs of the family, school, health, the poor, and the aged are all the responsibility of the people of God, not of the state. Gary DeMar, God and Government, Volume 1. I read all 3 volumes over the weekend. Really good series. Sarah was out of the house, so. Yeah, 1 Timothy 5:13 through 16. It talks about taking care of widows and the qualification for a widow. Because, if a widow's younger, she may be better off just remarrying. But if someone is of a certain age, as described in that chapter, they say, hey, take care of her. It's the duty of the church to take care of the elderly. Deuteronomy 4 through 6, all 3 chapters, talks about parents educating their children. Galatians 4, 1 through 2 also talks about parents having the ability to delegate out the responsibility of teaching their children. So while officially the government should not ideally have a hand in education, it is the parent's opportunity and ability to delegate it out to a tutor, to a private school, to the government. So if that's where parents want to send their kids, they can delegate out that responsibility. But because it is the parent's responsibility ultimately, parents are responsible for what their children are taught. So Later, if we have time, towards the end of the school year, we're going to talk about, is education biased? And we'll talk about a little bit about the public school systems and how really a religion's being promoted. It's just not Christianity per se, it's something else. So any parent that has kids in public schools are responsible for having taught their kids that.
I like being in public school.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I turned out okay, I think.
And you even went to Bob Jones.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, but ultimately, parents are responsible for this. The government is not. Other boundaries for the state. Ezra 7:24 says that the government ought not to tax the church. And the Founding Fathers even set it up that way, so they're tax exempt. But Lyndon B. Johnson kind of messed that up for us with the 501c3 organizations. But that's another talk for another day. Deuteronomy 32:8 talks about borders to a nation. The only reason I bring this verse up is, one, because God does establish first the borders. And two, there's a lot of talk in foreign policy today about moving certain borders, especially around the nation of Israel. And when people try to take Israel's property away from them, the citizens' duty to the government. I'm doing really good on time. We have a duty to the government. 1 Peter 2:13 through 14. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors as those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. We've been over this before. I hope that this verse kind of just sinks into your brain and stays there for a while, just because this is one of the really foundational verses in the New Testament about the purpose of government. And notice in the very beginning of it, it says, submit yourselves to every ordinance for the Lord's sake. We'll talk about some exceptions to that, but we really need to realize that no matter what government system we're under, that we need to submit ourselves to it. 1 Timothy 2:1 through 2, we are to pray for the government. Romans 12:14 through 21, we're supposed to let the law work. We don't take justice into our own hands. Just to read half of that to you, verse 17 and forward says, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place for wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if the enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. In other words, no matter what injustice happens to you in life, no matter what injustice may happen to you or someone else, and that emotional response comes, it is not our place. We are not delegated the authority to become a vigilante or take the law into our own hands. God set a legal system in place to take care of that. And if it's worked or if it's misworked and it doesn't take care of it, vengeance is the Lord's, not ours. So that's one of the key things that we need to remember when we have duty to the government, because oftentimes we see so many injustices. We want to come up with some sort of justification. It's like, I can't pay taxes. Some of that might go towards abortion or something else that is morally reprehensible. Jesus said, we'll get to that in the taxes in a minute, that we are to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And Jesus knew intimately the corruption of the Roman government, but he still said, give them their taxes. Luke 3:12 through 14, live justly and fairly. Matthew 23:1 through 4, obey your leaders, even when they are hypocrites. I know. That's a really fun one. Let me read this one to you. And Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works. For they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. And I think it's particularly interesting. His justification is the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So the seat of authority must be respected, even if the person sitting there is not respectable. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But don't do according to their works, for they say and do not do. Dooby-dooby-doo.
Question.
Yes.
If they tell you to do something that's against the Bible, what do? You don't do it.
That was not a setup. Just let you know. It's like, thank you, baby. Yes. So there are times that we are not to obey. Civil disobedience. We have a duty to the government to disobey it at times. So sometimes it's going to be abstaining from obeying the government. Like with Daniel, where he's told, eat this meat. I'm a vegetarian. That Daniel, I think it's chapter 1. Very interesting thing. For that time period, for him to tell the king, I'm a vegetarian, he knew, the king knew, but more importantly, he knew he could have been killed for it. Just for disobeying the dietary laws, or for disobeying their dietary rules, because he was obeying God's dietary laws for the time. He said, I'm sorry, I'm vegetarian, I can't. And they could eat some kosher meats, but,
Like fish.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you can look at, I think, Daniel chapter 3, at a certain time, he's supposed to bow to a king, or maybe it's the verse where, they said, no more praying in public. And he prayed at the certain hour, and someone saw him and turned him in. So there are times where the government's going to say, don't spread the gospel. Don't share your faith in public. If you do that in a mall, we're going to arrest you. And hey, if you're in a conversation somewhere and God's leading you, is it better to serve man or God? And there are other times where the government may say something, you have to do this action, and you know that it is against what God has said. And I'm being very abstract because it can be applied so many different ways. And I'm just trying to build the contrast of the government might tell you, don't do this, and God said, do this. And other times, the government might say, do this, and God said, don't do this. So it works both ways. In these circumstances, a proper understanding of what an individual or group can do must be had. Kind of just went over that. Daniel's chapters 1, 3, and 6. Acts 5:29. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, and this is right after they were reprimanded for preaching that Jesus was the Lord and he had risen from the grave, and they were proclaiming the gospel. And they said, don't speak of Jesus anymore. Peter responded, we ought to obey God rather than men. Exodus 1, 15 through 22. This is, this passage, if you really thought about it. Very beginning of Exodus. We're talking about Moses. How did Moses get to position such high power? How did he become one of Pharaoh's daughter's adopted sons? Well, in this passage, Pharaoh basically said, any Hebrew woman that is pregnant, the moment the child comes out, if it's a male, kill it. And the midwives, which were Egyptian, they were good. They made an excuse. They said, the Hebrew women, they give birth too quickly. They're not like Egyptians. They just pop them out, exactly. And so then, later on, Pharaoh says, the Hebrew males, as soon as they're born, throw them in the river, let them drown. That happened a lot until Moses' mother couldn't do it. She hid him for a while, knowing that if she was caught, dire consequences would happen. Put him in a basket, set him down the way, Pharaoh's daughter found him. And mercy was had. So good things can happen when you obey God rather than men. Gary DeMar offers a few options for civil disobedience. He gives it in 3 steps. First, protest. 1 Kings 12, 1 through 5. A new king comes to power, and the people say, I think it's Rehoboam comes to power. And people say, Solomon has made our burden too heavy. Would he make our burden lighter? He was making them work really, really hard to produce things. And so they protested the king. Please change the policy. And the king went to his council, and so on and so forth. So protest is an option. The second option, flee. And finally, use force in only defense purposes. Now, I've talked to some other peers and people I respect, and they have different levels of protest and disobedience, and some might be 5 steps. But the idea is, this may or may not be correct, but the primary idea is force should not be taken right away. No knee-jerk reactions, no vigilante groups. First thing we need to do is protest, peaceably, quietly, or not quietly, but peaceably. The use of force is really interesting. An example was given for the Founding Fathers. Before the Revolution, for 11 years, they petitioned the king for various grievances. Very good word, thank you. Various grievances. And then it was only to the point where they realized that the army across the Atlantic was coming over and setting up base, and some really bad things were about to happen, that they realized that they're going to have to declare themselves independent, create a new form of government that was just, and then revolt against the old form of government. And Francis Schaeffer says, for a corporate body, a civil entity, when illegitimate state acts are perpetrated upon it, resistance should be under the protection of a duly constituted authority. If possible, it should be under the rule of lesser magistrates, local governments. This applies both from the sense of if, say, the federal government gets crazy and lawless, the state government should take up for us, or at least the city. It also would apply if, in the case of the Founding Fathers, where they had to institute a new government, and then under the guise of a civil body, they are then able to revolt against an invading force. You don't really see any good examples of just a group of people saying, hey, let's revolt, and it being praised. Gary DeMar adds to this, if it is not done by a legitimate government, it is no better than anarchy. A local government or a new government formed by a declaration of independence could rebel against a tyrannical government, but only as self-defense and a last resort. Hey, we're done.